Welcome to the Dragon's Den, where I am your venerable host Orochi, and today we will be talking about the only thing that really matters: dragons. Specifically, Novice Dragoneer by E.E.Knight. But before I can go into the book itself, I must touch on the previous series done by Mr. Knight, Age of Fire, which came out like 2009, 2010, and 2011 ish. So it's like 10 years or so at least. It came out quite a while ago. He's been working on another series since then. And so this book is the start of a new series that takes place in the same world as Age of Fire. Which is, if you like that world, that's friggin' amazing. And it's great to see it fleshed out more. And it uses a lot of the same sort of backdrop stuff, like they introduced certain aspects of the way dragons are, and the way they use language, and the way they talk, the way they name stuff, and all this, their general tendencies and stuff, which is great because you just pick up from the knowledge you already have, or you slowly build it up through this book, because it basically lays everything back down, except for there was maybe one or two things that I think I probably got out of this book that somebody who didn't reach Age of Fire did, but it's super minor stuff, like dragons have specific words for their foreclaws and their aft claws, si and sa. And I think there's one point where it says, where one of the dragons is like, just put this on my si and let's go. And if you don't know what that is, then, you figure it out, because then they immediately tell you what happens so you can figure it out. But, just things like that, where the second you see it, if you know what it is, you'll be like, hey, this is a callback, and just fits with the world, and so you feel at home. Whereas otherwise, you're just being introduced to this stuff. And so it's done really well. There's no point where you won't feel like you needed to read the previous stuff. But if you did, then it'll be like you're coming back home. Except for one major difference, and it's kind of, it sticks on my I hate books that do this kind of shit, and that, this is a dragon riding novel. The main character is a human, and I generally dislike dragon riding novels, which is why I have a whole host of books that are suggested to me that are all dragon riding stuff, and I'm all like, I'm not sure if I can get into this. I've read like 15, 20 of the short little previews of the beginnings of the books, and most of these do not look like books that I will enjoy, because they don't get around, and neither did this one, frankly, because they don't get around to showing how the dragons act, and that is a big stickler for me. Big. Because there's another series that I started, which I'll be making a review for soon. I haven't gotten around to it just because of this one aspect, and that the dragon in it seems to be like an intelligent animal. And that pisses me off. Like, when stories are just like, dragons are just like, they're a really smart dog, and that sort of stuff irritates the shit out of me. Like, if that's all the author ever goes into them being, then I hate that. Whereas there's another series that I need to still do a review on, where the dragons cannot communicate but are highly intelligent. And that's, a crux of the story is that dragons are used and abused as livestock and stuff because they cannot communicate with humans that, hey, we're a lot smarter than you give us credit for. And even amongst themselves, it is a big problem that they can't communicate. And I don't think any other author has really approached it that way, when that could alleviate my distaste for the Dragon Rider sort of stuff if they gave it credit that, yeah, they're not just like smart animals, they're at least human levels of intelligence, if not higher. They just don't share the communication methods that we do. And yes, that's hard to get into. Like, how exactly would you go into that if you're not doing it from the dragon's perspective? And that is where this book series differentiates from Age of Fire, because Mr. Knight's previous series was from the dragon's perspective, which is why it was, especially for its time, groundbreaking and amazing series. And I highly suggest going to read the first 4 books. If you read people's reviews on them, you will know that the last 2 books in the series take a nosedive in quality and just the story, and I cannot fathom what his intentions were, but I never read the last book because the second to last one was so bad, and just everything that happened was, I'm just like, none of this needs to happen. This isn't a good, compelling story. It's realistic. They did, espionage and, social engineering kind of garbage, and it's like, oh, these characters are in high society and people are trying to backstab them and all this stuff. And it's like, cool, that's, that kind of stuff can be done well, but it wasn't in these book series, and the characters just get trashed on and thrown out with the garbage, and I'm like, this isn't a compelling story. There's nothing really going on here. It's just not going anywhere that anybody really cared to go, and that can be shown by all the bad reviews that it has. So, but at that time, and like, that was probably one of the series that broke me at the time, because in the 2000s I read a bunch of stories that had really terrible endings. Fantastic stories up until they just decided, hey, we're just going to take a nosedive into, this is a realistic ending, and life generally doesn't end happy for most people, and life sucks, and then it's about how you deal with it that really matters. So here, our characters who have been through all this bad stuff have a bad ending, and that's it. And I'm like, do we not read fantasy stories so that we can have happy fantasy endings? Like, isn't the point that these characters go through terrible stuff so that they can get their happy endings? It doesn't need to be a happy Disney kind of ending, but holy shit, don't just throw your characters out into the garbage. Like, I read so many books that were like that at the time, and I stopped reading for a while. I was just like, if this is the trend, I don't want to read anymore. But the first 3 books, especially from Age of Fire, highly recommended, because it's all about this pair of dragons who have a clutch, and it's all about their children and how their children get split up, and each of the 3 books is about a different hatchling and how they make their way in the world, and then the 4th book is how they come back together again, and it's super good. It's fantastic. So that's a big thing you have to know with Novice Dragoneer. Is like, this isn't about the dragons. It is about a young girl. She's 14 at the beginning of the story, and she's an orphan raised in a really shabby, low quality orphanage. Most of the time, you probably think of, like, I think the society's ingrained image of orphanages are like, giant mansions that have been turned into orphanages, and they have old women who are their patrons and are brutally strict and that sort of thing. None of that here. It's more just like a cottage that's run by a fisherman / pirate who's a filthy, disgusting, overbearing pile of shit, and he treats the kids poorly, and they're all destitute, have no money, all that sort of stuff. So it's a bit of a shift from, I think, what most people probably think of orphanages, but still it gets that same kind of vibe where super poor, strict, no education, all this kind of stuff. It's just a place to put them, to get them out of society, right? So that's her background, and it changes the day she meets a dragon and the dragon's rider. And that sort of sets the pace for the entire story. Everything that happens in this book is paced like waves on a shore. It's going along steady, and then something happens to change the course of the story, and then everything that happens after that is just the character dealing with this impact on their life and trying to come to a new normal until everything settles back down and the next wave hits. And that is the pacing of this whole book. It'll just be, boom, something happens, you'll see the fallout for it, and then the character will get into a sort of complacency for a while until, boom, the next thing happens to them, and they go. And in this way, it sort of feels like the character doesn't have any agency in their story because they're not actively pursuing any of these changes most of the time. Most of the time, it's just them dealing with stuff that's happening to them. But she does have an overarching goal, so she has put herself in a direction, and it's her dealing with all the things that keep knocking her off that course and how she can course correct to get back to it. So some people might think that that's sort of like a slow method of storytelling because there's lots of dips in the story of how things just get, complacent and smoothed out and going along steadily before, boom, something big happens. But I like that this is like a full novel. Unlike a lot of the stories I read are like, 150, 200 pages. This is more like a 500-page book. So it's much more of a full novel than most of the stuff I've been reading lately. But you could probably cut out like a third of it if you just wanted to get rid of all of the slower sections. But I think all of these waves that keep hitting against her build up her character. They are all small parts of who she is, and they all cause her to change and grow little by little. And I love this sort of storytelling because I would be happy with a slice of life kind of story at the end of every novel series that I read. Out of every trilogy or whatever, when the characters are done with their huge adventures, I would be fine with just a slice of life. It's like, how do they continue their living? I love these characters. Just keep going. So I don't mind that things have slow valleys and high peaks. That's fine for me because it's all building the character and they're constantly doing stuff. Even if it doesn't seem like those things are important, she's still growing because of how young she is. So it's even in the slower parts, it might not be emphasized enough how these slower sections are changing her, but they are. And so it really depends if you like that sort of storytelling. I think it's fine and it's fantastic, but some people might think that it's slow. So even though it's a dragon rider story, and honestly, the dragons don't even come into this story until like the halfway point or later. And that's sort of why I'm interested in this, because I know that Mr. Knight has a great ability to tell dragon stories. He's done it before. So having to wait so long to be introduced to some dragons was kind of painful, but her whole introduction into this school and it's, the academy, and it's not like any sort of academy you would think of, which is another huge shift on the sort of, standard themes and tropes for, school/academy genre. Is most academies are basically government-run institutions where they're training either, mages to be part of society or children to be part of society to better them, like, college and education sort of stuff, or military camps where they're training them to be part of the military war machine. This is sort of like this because the place they go to is called the Serpentine, and it is 100% a war machine. It is all about training Dragoneers and dragons to work together to go to war. And at the start of the book, they're at war with their neighboring country, the people of the South. And by the time she goes to join, they're at an armistice. They're not at peace, but there's been a ceasefire called, and that's going to be a big part of the ongoing story, is this background of, we need to train these kids to be war ready because at any time we might have to go to battle. So that's part of the backdrop of what's going on. And so having to wait so long to see the dragons was a little bit rough. And it never really... The dragons don't really become big characters in the story so far. She meets several of them and spends time with them, and it's really cool. But it's mostly just about her and her experiences getting into this academy and how it's run. And so, not being state-sponsored, that means they have to do a lot of things to get money that are... You would probably think, they have to play politics and do all of, commission work, and they take jobs from nobles, and they take donations and all this other stuff. So they have to be part of this political sphere and be doing all this other stuff so that they can just get the money they need just to survive, which puts more strain on one of their core tenets, is that they're all about honor. One of the stories that's told to her early on is about a novice who went with his Dragoneer to a mountain or something to meet somebody, and then they got called off on a mission to attack a site or do something, a dangerous sort of thing. So they left this boy there, and by the time they came back, they found the boy frozen to death outside of a cave at the top of this mountain. And they said that this is a teaching point, that what this kid did is what they expect of good, honorable Dragoneers. He was told to stay there and wait for their return, and that's what he did, even though it cost him his life. And so that's sort of this big thing, is like they value honor above all other things. And when you start mixing that with having to gain money and stuff, it's like, well, those two kind of things don't really mix together. So it's an interesting sort of thing where a lot of nobility send their kids to this academy just so that they can get prestige and experience doing these sort of things. But, rich people don't ever want their kids to be in harm, so they don't expect their kids to ever be put on the front line, go to war. And so they make donations and stuff to keep this thing running so that their children can get this prestige, and sort of like sending them to, what are they called? There's schools and stuff that are specifically like that, and some people literally send their kids to military schools for that sort of thing. And so that's sort of what the Serpentine is it's in this juxtaposition of they value their honor, but they also have to do all this other stuff that is maybe not quite what you would consider things honorable people do, just that they can get the money to keep themselves together. And that's also one of the problems that a lot of the kids working there start to uncover. There's like, well, they're basically all free help. Like, only they take in like 100 to 200 kids a year, and they get rid of half of those numbers within a few weeks, and then they trickle out after that. But realistically, they're only going to raise up in rank a dozen kids a year, maybe like 6 to 12 at most. So you've got dozens and dozens of young people who are working at this place, and they're not really getting paid. It's almost like volunteer work. The story doesn't really get into that, like what they get out of it very much, because they don't really make any. The main character, at least, doesn't ever make any money. So you gotta. But some of the other apprentices that are much older make a living. So it's kind of this thing where they're doing a lot of cheap labor kind of stuff. And so that kind of, you can also look at that as like, that's not healthy or noble or anything either. But, you got to do what you got to do to make things work. But it sort of makes a very unhappy working condition of, you're doing these tough jobs, and it's supposed to be building character and all these things. But if that's going to be the rest of your life, if you don't have a chance to realistically increase your status here, then why the fuck do you want to stay there? After you've built up some skills that you could maybe sell elsewhere, like, why would you stay? And that's also some of the reasons why a lot of them leave. So it's a very interesting place. There's a lot of different stuff going around, and a lot of different angles. Different people have different expectations when going there. But the first thing that happens to the main character is that she's 6 years old. She's going up to a well to get some water, and I don't recall if she was physically beaten or just yelled at a bunch for being slow a bunch of times. So she's super trying to hurry, but then this dragon lands next to her, and she's just awestruck because she's seen them a few times before, and she loves dragons. She thinks they're amazing. And the rider gets off, they talk for a while, and the rider lets her get up into the saddle, and the dragon raises her up some, and it is just the highlight of her life. And this Dragoneer says, when you are old enough, come to the Serpentine and ask for me, and I will get you in. And so that sets her life goal to become a Dragoneer. And then the story goes into another lull of, and it sort of skips it. That the next, 8 years of her life is just surviving at the lodge. And then she finds, an opening ticket that says, oh, hey, they're recruiting on this day. What is it, the summer solstice, I think? Or maybe the spring solstice. There's a festival or whatever, and that's the one time a year where the doors are open, you can go in, and they're taking applicants. And so she runs away from the lodge, travels 3 days with almost no provisions to get there, and she misses the queue. They close the doors before she gets there. And then she haggles some, gets shown to the side door and told, just stay there until they let you in. She asked the guy, hey, I was told that I could get in here. And he's like, no, you missed it. Come back next year. And so that starts up a repeating cycle of, she is determined. This is her only thing that she wants in her life, and there is nothing else for her. Because when she left the lodge, she burned that bridge. Because if she goes back, they will beat her, and she has no chance of ever having a decent life there. And so she even thinks about throwing herself off this cliff edge while she's waiting there. But she's like, no, I need this. No matter what happens, I have to I would rather die waiting here at this doorstep than turn away, because at least I will show that this is what I wanted. And that's kind of how she is through the whole story, is that she's just, I need to persevere through this however I can to get to my goal. And all these things just keep happening to her, and she keeps constantly getting into trouble, but people like her because she's sort of a goody two-shoe. She's, like most protagonists are, she's good. She wants to help people. She would rather everybody around her be happier than not. But one of her key aspects of why she's constantly treated like garbage by most people is because she has a stutter. And it's sort of weird because it's not even that bad. Like, Mr. Knight even puts in his afterwards in the book that he talked to a speech specialist about these sort of things to, get some background on how to properly represent this sort of thing, which is great. But my cousin, who was my age when I was growing up, had a big stutter. And comparing that to Illith, the main character here's stutter, is like, her stutter's barely there. And she does the one thing that I wish most people who had speech impediments would do. She'll start a sentence, get to the part where she can't do, and if possible, she will change the things that she wants to say to something else that she can get her mouth around. But not always. There's plenty of times where she's, like, she has to repeat something or say a specific thing, or she's just trying to say, well, my, and it's like, you can't really, there's no other words for it, so she has to say it that way, so she stutters over it. But it's never written in such a way where you reading it, or if you're listening to the audiobook, would be like, man, this is obnoxious. And I kind of see that as two ways. It's like, you don't want it to be obnoxious because you don't want to be obnoxious to your readers, but making it not that bad kind of dulls the effect of, why do they treat her so bad when her stutter isn't really terrible? I've been around plenty of people who had it much, much worse speech impediments than Illith does. So it's kind of a wishy-washy sort of thing. It's like, well, is this the happy medium? Could it have been done better? I don't know, because it could alienate some people. But, and I think a lot of the times when it's really bad, like, there's a point where she gets sworn in as a novice, which is basically just, everyone who makes it past, like, the first week or so gets sworn in as a novice, so it's not like a huge stepping point or whatever. It's just a, hey, you're in, and we won't immediately kick you out for any reason. You have to do something now specifically for us to kick you out. And you have to repeat this oath, which takes her like 3 times longer than everybody else because she's stumbling over the words. And you can tell by other characters' reactions that they immediately hate her for it. And some of them even talk shit right there for it. And I think there are enough good characters in the story, like just, warm, loving characters, that when something bad happens to Illith, these good characters are automatically like drawn to her to protect her, because they're like, yeah, when we see people shitting on somebody, we want to help that person because they don't deserve that. And so I think her stutter actually endears her to a lot of these characters that help her through troubling times. And so you can kind of see that her big character flaw is also kind of the thing that makes her endearing to a lot of people. It's also kind of one of her strongest elements, even though it's really hard to see something that way. But most of the characters that she hangs around with and has good character growth with are those characters who were drawn to her when something bad happened to her because of her stutter, or because she's poor and has no money or no feasible way to do even the most basic things. And that's a very interesting sort of character trait, that, hey, your weakest trait, your character flaw, is also a strength of your character. It's very, very interesting. And she gets in, does all this stuff, and gets into trouble a lot, which is sort of she rarely instigates anything, but lots of things happen to her, and it's the way she and other characters deal with those things that define who she is and how she grows, which is very interesting. But most of the time, she's not actively doing things that make the big plot hooks and story turns in the overall arcing story, which is sort of she's, especially through the first like 3/4 of the story, she's a very passive character, because she has learned from a young age nobody wants to hear her talk, so she keeps her mouth shut. And for a long time, whenever she gets into a place where she doesn't have to speak, she's happy. She's just like, I love this. I don't have to talk to people. This is great. Nobody can see the bad side of me and get upset by it. So she's all about keeping her head down, keeping a low profile while trying to achieve her goal. But when you think about it, it's like, if you're trying to raise ranks in a place, like, keeping your head down isn't the way to do it. So the things that happen to her, even though they're generally bad things, are sort of like, these are the only reasons why she progresses at all and doesn't become just another name in the books and just a casual worker for the rest of her life. So it's repeatedly happens that all these bad things are also kind of good things, because she comes out better for them all the time. Which is, I think, if you try to look at life like that, life doesn't actually work like that. But if that's your thought process, then that would make you happier most of the time, I think. And it's a good philosophy to have. There's like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's a very prevalent theme in this book, that all these bad things keep happening to her, and she comes out the other side better for it. When the dragons eventually do get introduced, it is the most profound interaction between characters, and it sticks with you, because she's put down into the cellar, the lowest level of the section of the Serpentine called the Beehive, where all the dragons reside. And there's an ancient dragon there who's been around hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're all like, yeah, he's gonna die soon. He's old. He just sits there doing nothing for months on end. I don't even think they've said how long he's been stuck down there. I think most people have come to work there and left or died in the time that he's been there. So this dragon has been just laying there waiting for his death, or whatever he's waiting for, since before anybody who is currently alive at the Serpentine got there, which is that is a huge thing. And he stops eating, which is why Illith is sent down to try and cheer him up, because at that time that's the job she has, is cheering dragons up. She becomes a dragon dancer, which, if you read The Age of Fire, you know that there's, and Mr. Knight puts it in the afterword in this book, that the person who gave him this idea for this sort of thing, and he put it in the original series, that it's basically an explanation of why we have all of these myths and everything about young maidens being kidnapped by dragons. And honestly, I would have just rather him not put that in than put it in, because it feels cringy so bad that it's, especially male dragons enjoy the smell of human female sweat. Sweaty women is like an aphrodisiac to them, and well, like a drug. And in the first series, in the Age of Fire, it becomes a thing in the dragon royal circles that some of them get addicted to this smell, and it just drives them crazy like a friggin' drug. They just become addicted to it and they cannot live without it. And so it's super cringy in the first series, and it's so weird to include it in this one, because if it's like a drug, if it's say it's like friggin' oxycodone or that sort of stuff, where it's like good in very small doses, but you can easily OD on it and become addicted, then having people whose job it is to do this thing is kind of a like, well, they should know how to regulate it and stuff, but that never comes up. It's a just, hey, you just do this thing every day to try and make these dragons happy. And so it's super weird and just, I don't like it. I think it could have been done a little bit better. The way Illith specifically looks at it, she's like, her job isn't to just get sweaty in front of dragons. She views it as her job is to make them happy. And dancing is a way for certain dragons, it takes the edge off for them, you know? It's like prescribing them a little bit of, you know, antidepressants and, you know, pain pills and that sort of thing. It eases their mind when they're having a bad day and that sort of stuff. And the way she goes about it is also more like friggin' the movie that came out in like the 90s or whatever, Deuce Bigalow, American Gigolo. Like, that movie was just a parody of a quote-unquote ugly guy who's nowhere near the status of, you know, super hot gigolo guy, gets this role, and he excels at it because all he does is sit and talk with these women and go over he just talks with them and, you know, does things to make them happy, whether it's massages or whatever. And Illith sort of looks at dragon dancing in that way, where it's like, her job is just to make the dragons happy. If that's dancing, fine. But there's also certain dragons who she just sits and talks with or listens to. There's a specific dragon who his only thing that he does is talk about his one claim to fame, where he was the reason why they won a certain battle in a war some time ago, and he just talks about that endlessly for hours and hours and hours. And so you can pick up from the details that happen that, you know, the job is more than just dancing and sweating, which I think could have come up as a conversation between the dancers to have been more emphasized as that's the way to look at it, whereas it comes up so many times that they're basically exotic dancers. And a lot of the dancers, you know, they get hired out for other people. And then, you know, it sort of becomes like, yeah, they're almost like strippers, because they go off, they perform for these rich men, and then these rich men are like, oh yeah, let's get married because you're hot as fuck. And so there's all these negative connotations for it, and I think it could have done the story well to have Illith's point of view of it reinforced more and talked about more, to just give it more positive reinforcement, because later on in the story it becomes a much bigger thing. But her first big assignment is going down to the cellar and talking to this one dragon, and it's wasn't the first dragon to be introduced in the story, but it's the first one where she spends a lot of time with him, and a lot of stuff happens, and she eventually gets him to wake and eat, and they become fast friends. And she spends, I think, 2+ months down there, where she basically just sleeps down there and gets to know him. And then some stuff happens. He saves her life, and then he dies because the exertion is too much for him. And he basically calls her daughter when he dies, and he leaves her like all of his possessions within the Vale where they live, like the country they live. He's lived in like so much of the world that he's got stashes of stuff that he left to other places, but all the stuff that's here he left to her and called her his daughter, which shows you the bond that they had and how to view her job as just, you get to know them and you get on their good side and you do whatever you can to make their lives better, because she loves dragons. That's her whole thing, where I think a lot of the other characters are just, that's not their primary interest, so they don't look at things the way she does. Which I'm very glad that she basically shares the kind of outlook that I do, which is great. You know, it's like, yes, make dragons happy. Fantastic. So that is a huge sticking point to the introduction of dragons, and it is hugely emotional. And the fallout from this happening is fantastic. But then eventually, the story turns to a really strange bit where her and a friend of hers who is higher up in rank than that she is and has saved her life once, they get used as currency to trade for a prisoner of war. So during this armistice, Illith and this other, I think Gala's I don't know if she's a novice at that point, I don't remember, but they get traded for a higher ranking member to go down there and stay and take care of the dragon who has been captured there for like 4 years, I think. And so they're to look after the dragon while he's still a prisoner of war. And then she gets immersed for over a year in the culture of basically her enemy. And it is super, super weird because they're basically just it's a kingdom, as opposed to the Vale is called the Republic. And it is super, super weird, and it just leaves this bad taste in my mouth that the Southerners are called Galantines, and they are just straight up the American South. Like 1700s American South, just to a T. That's what they are. And it's really weird to just be so on the nose about it. And even more so because these people call the Northerners Republicans because they have a republic. And it's just so weird. Just, I don't know. It struck me as being bizarre and just kind of off-putting. But I'm not going to go into the details of their outlook on things versus other stuff, because it's a little bit too on the nose of what they're trying to represent. And I don't know exactly what the author was trying to say by putting these like straight up mirrors into the story, because there's no real takeaway from it. It's just showing these things, and I don't want to draw any conclusions because it might upset some people. But she gets a good view of how they view things, and one of their core things is that they obey their church, and their church believes that dragons are evil, and if not evil, then they're just beasts of burden. And that blows her mind because she's like, I literally spent two plus months learning from an ancient dragon because she learned some Drakeen. She learned, like, he lent her all of these books to read, and then in his will he left her like his library of books. So she has tons of stuff to learn. And so when they say, oh, well, dragons are just beasts of burden, there's like, they're not intelligent. She's like, how can you say that? I can literally go and have a conversation with a dragon right now to prove you wrong. And they're like, oh, well, that's just a trick you do, like getting dogs to stand up on their hind legs or shake paw. Or like, they don't mention it, but I think if they had mentioned, you know, like how cockatiels and parrots and stuff can quote unquote talk, that it's like, oh, it's just like that. And it is such a dismissive attitude that it is just mind-numbing how anybody could come to that conclusion, because it's obvious it's just plainly obvious that that's not true. But these people don't want anything to do with dragons. They hate being near dragons, so they don't ever want to spend the time to even be proved wrong. And that situation resolves, and then the book closes up. But it basically sets the stage of there's going to be a lot of political intrigue and a lot of wartime stuff and just a lot of different angles of espionage and trying to keep things together while still doing her normal stuff. Because I think as she raises up in the ranks, she's going to get more and more responsibility, which is going to lead to more and more problems because she's going to have to actively take a role in figuring this stuff out. And one of the interesting things about her character is that before meeting the dragon in the cellar, whose name's the Lodger, before meeting him, she's uneducated. She barely knows how to read, write, do some math. Like, for being in a really scummy orphanage, she's moderately educated, you could guess. But a lot of the nobility and stuff in the Serpentine, like, they send tutors to their kids on like a weekly basis. And so she's so far behind on the learned scale that you cannot say that she's an intelligent character, because she does not have the background of knowledge. She has very little knowledge of the world. And it's not that she's naive, because that has definitely been crushed out of her. It's just that she's not educated. And I think it's extremely interesting as part of her character that she's still smart. She's not educated, but she's still witty, and she's still clever, because she comes up with solutions to things that like nobody else could. And even early on, some stuff happens and she gets into a fight where she asks for a duel against, she's a 14-year-old skinny, scrawny, underdeveloped girl. And they even say, is like, are you sure you're 14? You look younger than that, because she's stunted and malnourished and just tiny and frail. And these things happen. She gets attacked by this guy and calls out for a duel against him. And he is an overweight 30-plus-year-old guy. And so you look at that and it's just like this. There's leading up to the fight, like you're like, there's no way she can win this fight. It's not possible, and it sort of starts bringing in these fears of, is the story going to take this, poorly written feminist turn, because there's so much of that stuff out there right now, but it ends so beautifully that I loved it, because I was afraid for a bit. I was just like, she can't win this fight without luck. I would be fine if she just gets super lucky, because that's basically the story of her life, is like, things happen to her, and it's the way that she deals with them, and getting lucky and being witty and having the perseverance to overcome these things that make her who she is. And so the resolution of this fight could have gone two different ways that I would have been happy with, that it was getting into in the heat of the moment, and I was like, yeah, this is fine. This is a great resolution to how this worked out, because it could have gone bad. But seeing as she never becomes a combatant, that's never part of her character. She's at every step of the way is like, yeah, a stronger character, even an older female character, could easily just do whatever they want, knock her around, hold her down, whatever. She never has like absolute physical autonomy like dragons do, and that's usually one of the things that I hate about Dragon Rider stories that have female protagonists, because it always seems this sort of thing is like, oh, overcompensation, because females generally can't hold their own in combat physically against men, so you overcompensate by giving her a dragon, which is the epitome of physical strength. And that rubs me the wrong way, because no matter where you go, it's like, oh, well, then you make her stupid strong because magic and stuff. And I'm like, that's just not interesting. Whereas here, Illith makes her way through by just being clever and just dealing with problems. Even when she gets injured and stuff, she just deals with problems in the most efficient, effective way for her, and it's great. It's such a good character without ever having to have that, physical stuff is always, might always be her weakness, and that would be cool too, because she makes up for it in other ways. The second book is already out. I'm going to be reading that soon, and I'll put out a review from that probably in a couple weeks when I finish that. But it's going to be very interesting with all the political intrigue and stuff. But I really hope that she has more time to work with the dragons, because she has a good reputation amongst several dragons already, and I would just like her to have more time with them to develop their characters, because learning more about each dragon's personality is great, because there's a few of them that are bad or annoying and stuff, and I really like the trope of the honorable / the crap, I can't think of what it's called right now, the good beast, the beneficial beast, beneficent, like having the nobility, and the core of nobility being that you must serve others and be good to people. And I like the idea that these dragons are generally good-natured and they get along with people, but they have a lot of downsides. They tend to be lazy, they're a little bit arrogant and all this other stuff, but they tend to, more so than your average human, they tend to be good-natured and want to help people. And I really like that as a common trait for dragons. because I don't like things that are just like, oh, they're just like people. It's like, well, if you're going to have different races in a story, then they need to act differently. They need to have different values and different outlooks on stuff, because just making them human slightly different just, it doesn't sit well with me. It just kind of annoys me. So that's the end. Yeah, it's the end of the book. That's everything, all the big stuff that happens. So I dove into this too fast because it's such a good book. I didn't say at the beginning like I usually try to. It's like, yes, read this book. It's good. And it's because I went to talk about the Age of Fire too much. Read the first 4 books of that too. It'll give you a little bit of history on this. But this book is also, you know, it takes place hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the first series. And I don't like time skips like that, because I think you're just leaving everything else behind so that it almost doesn't matter. And there's a game that came out within the last few years that did that a lot of people love, and the more I find out about it, the more I don't like it, because of all the reasons a lot of people like it, which is super weird. But time skips are generally they're really bad. They break up continuity, and you're just stretching it so thin that it's like, oh, well, these might as well be 2 unrelated stories at that point, because they can't touch back enough on it, especially when you have human societies that's like, these societies have changed so much, and they reference, you know, the ancient Hypatians, which were in the first book. The average human was a Hypatian at that time, I believe. And so it's like, oh yeah, that was the ancient people. We sort of still have their bloodline. It's like, there's almost nothing left of anything that was in that book. So does it really matter? Hopefully they'll get more callbacks later or something. But yeah, I'm not a fan of that sort of stuff. But definitely a good book, even though it's mostly about the human character, which I'm not a fan of. I love this writing style, and the character's great. So definitely go... Excuse me. That's not good. Definitely go and read this. It's good stuff. That is all for now. Have a great evening.